And Emily's going to be talking about the Legend of St. Eustace, which was the mural in Canterbury Cathedral. It's in the North Choir. You can go there and see it. That's a painting which first inspired Oswald Hoban to write the novel Willy Walker. So, Emily, over to you. Is that good for you?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much,
Hey,
Paul. And thank you to all the organizers for this fantastic event. And I wish I could be in Canterbury Cathedral with you pointing at this wonderful mural, but alas, here we are working through a screen. Now, I'm well aware of the use and the inspiration and the significance of this extraordinary late medieval wall painting for the imagination of Holbein, and how it sort of catalyzes and triggers this post-apocalyptic vision. And I love the sort of meta relationship of this author having a vision while looking at this saint having a mystic vision. I think this is something that's such fun, but I must confess to all of you that I'm really a medieval art historian. So what I want to do with this talk is to give you the nitty-gritty background of the story of Saint Eustache, the story of his cult, and the story behind this wall painting. And I just want to draw your attention to the acknowledgments in this wonderful novel. I do find it interesting that Holbein talks about how he really seems to have lingered over Tristram's reconstruction. And I'm going to be speaking about Ernst William Tristram in this paper too. He was a restorer of medieval wall paintings working in Canterbury Cathedral in the 1930s. And for any of you who have been to the cathedral, to have a long look at this weird stag and the crucified Christ between his antlers, you'll know full well that the mural's actually quite hard to see. So I do think it's important to remember that the author was able to sort of untangle the iconography by coming face to face with this wonderful 1930s restoration, or rather, excuse me, watercolor reinterpretation that's still on display today. And I do think, too, it's worth saying that the sort of summary of the legend presented in the novel is excellent and correct. But of course, the thing I want to do for the next sort of 30 minutes is retell the story of Saint Eustache, and just to sort of show you that it, too, is actually a wonderful work of mystic fiction. So where to begin? Well, as a medievalist, what I need to do is to begin with hagiography. And that's the genre, the term we use to look at the writing, the holy writings about saints. And I want to explain that the worship of Saint Eustache continues today in many types of churches. He is celebrated in liturgical calendars on the 20th of September, which is meant to mark the day when he, his wife, and his 2 sons were boiled to death in a cauldron shaped like a bull. And I'll get to that at the very end. It is assumed that he was a Roman soldier, and it is assumed that he was put to death in the year 118. Now, I hate to sort of break this to you, but I think since the mid-20th century, historians have also assumed that this cult, the identity of Eustache, and the legendary story of all the things he did is unfortunately an invention. But I'll get to the bottom of that later on. In terms of the evidence for worshiping Saint Eustache and creating the legend of this high status Roman hunter, this mystic vision in a deer's antlers, pirates, kidnapping, lions, etc. The earliest visual evidence we have comes from 7th century cave paintings in Cappadocia, which is pretty cool. So there seems to have been the origin site of this Roman soldier cult would have been in late antique Asia Minor, what is today present-day Turkey. There is evidence for people worshiping this man in Rome as early as 795. There's a diaconia set up for him. That's a hospital church. So he's, from the beginning of his cult in Europe, he's associated with healing, which I think is very important. He appears in sort of the rituals from 9th century Constantinople. And then you start to have this obsession with Saint Eustache in the Carolingian period in France. So France really adopts this story. And you have a metrical vetus, that's a rhymed Latin song composed in his honor in the 9th century. I'm showing you an image here on the right of a Byzantine ivory, which is gorgeous, pairing Saint Eustache with another very famous soldier saint, Yorgos or George. So this is, again, more evidence that he was admired as this tough soldier. But I think the story that Hoban learns and the story that matters to our understanding of the mural and its relationship to the novel really, really comes down to us through something called the Legenda Aurea, or the Golden Legend. Now, the Golden Legend is the equivalent of a bestseller in the 13th century. It was compiled by a man called Jacobus de Voragine, who was then Archbishop of Genoa. And this is a sort of, it's every big saint's legend arranged in chronological order of when you celebrate them in the annual celebration of the Christian calendar. And it's there that we learn we learn all about Saint Eustache. He compiles and combines a ton of other texts to present a digestible, clear version of the legend. And that's where we learn that this saint really has two names, Placidus and Eustache. And Jacobus opens his text by explaining the significance of those names. He's pleasant to the Lord, but then after his baptism, he brings good fortune. So having outlined the kind of problematic and patchy nature of the origins of the cult of Saint Eustache, I just want to draw your attention to a few other places where we can still see evidence of devotion to the hunter who was burned in a bull. On the right is a wonderful capital from the Abbey Church of Vesely. On the left, there's that sort of wonderful early 8th century cult site in San Eustachio in Rome. I hope you can see the 11th century belfry behind the Baroque facade. And of course, here's the wonderful ruined Abbey of San Eustachio and Pontone in Amalfi. So Eustache gets everywhere, and he's especially popular with, you guessed it, communities that like hunting and like animals. So how did his cult circulate? The story is just so much fun. It appears everywhere. There are hundreds of different medieval manuscripts that relate the legend of St. Eustache, and I'm showing you on the screen here a Middle English example now in the Bodleian. And in fact, this collection of popular Middle English verses, the entry for St. Eustache comes first. So just to sort of recap here, he really becomes popular in the later medieval imagination, and it's in part because the legend is just so flexible, so weird, so entertaining, so delightful. And just to add that this manuscript is fully digitized online thanks to the Bodleian. So who is this man, and what is our other evidence for the cult? Well, next time you go to London, you can come face to face with him. What you're looking at on the screen is a head reliquary made of gold and rock crystal, and it's covered in gems. And at the base of it, in that pedestal, there are 9 fragments of his alleged skull, which is quite fun. Now, this object was assembled by a medieval craftsman around the year 1180. We know it was worshipped in Basel Cathedral at some stage in the later Middle Ages. So again, there's lots of body parts of Eustache that draw attention to his story. And I'm going to come back to that at the end when I talk about what is this mural doing in Canterbury. And I just want to show you this really fun image of how you'd open the head reliquary, you pop open the cap like an egg, and then reach in and touch his holy skull, which is quite fun. A little macabre, but enjoyable too. So the other thing I wanted to draw to our attention is we think the cult of St. Eustache arrives in England via these nurturing channels of social networks and connections in France. We know that there's a chapel dedicated to St. Eustache by the 1140s in the Royal Abbey of Saint-Denis, just to the north of Paris. Everyone should go there if you've never been. It's the most wonderful Gothic abbey. He appears in a very detailed kind of graphic novel, as it were, in the stained glass windows at Chartres Cathedral, which I'll walk you through in a few minutes. And those the design of which date to the 1210s. And then this huge church in Paris, for those of you who've been to Les Halles, the former site of the medieval market in Paris, it's the thumping big parish church of the whole community there. It's dedicated to St. Eustache, and that dedication required body parts of Eustache to be put in the high altar, and it has been named in his honor since the 1210s. So I'm just trying to show you here how the cult is building momentum, how more and more people seem interested in this enigmatic, mystic, legendary figure. So the archetypal image art historians tend to associate with his cult is vision. Now, just to clarify, there are a number of other hunter saints in the Christian imagination who, get this, who also have visions of Christ crucified between the antlers of deer. And I'll, again, unpack the story in a moment. But another example would be a man called Saint Hubert. And for those of you who like Jägermeister alcohol, you'll see that that's part of their brand, is the vision of the crucified Christ between the antlers of a deer. I'm showing you two other examples of this archetypal composition that we have in Canterbury Cathedral, and perhaps more famous works of art. On the left is a wonderful engraving by Albrecht Dürer in a number of collections. It dates to around the year 1501. And on the right is Pisanello's gorgeous tempera painting of the Vision. And I do think it's important to note that the composition, the iconographic control of the story of the legend is quite formulaic. You'll note that in most representations from the later Middle Ages, that it moves sort of from left to right, the direction of the focus. The deer is to the right, the saint is to the left. And it's not to say that all of these images are copying one another, but I just want to draw our attention to the fact that there's a quite sort of, firm iconographic system in place by the 15th century, and our mural in Canterbury was painted. So the version of events that we get about the legendary life of St. Eustache really comes to us in the popular imagination from the Golden Legend, which I mentioned earlier. And we have a number of interesting aspects of sort of dialogue in this text too. And I'll get to the real hagiographic narrative in a moment, but I just want to draw your attention to the moment of revelation here by quoting the saint himself as he is meant to have had his revelation at dark wood. When he saw the stag, and when he encountered the image of Christ crucified between its antlers, perhaps this isn't clear from the novel, or perhaps it's something that's, I don't know, I think it is worth sharing. The tiny figurine of the dead Christ then apparently speaks to Eustache, and he addresses him by his former name, Placidus. I am Jesus Christ, who formed heaven and earth, who brought forth life and divided her from darkness, who ordained the days and the years, created man from the slime of the ground, and who appeared to the world in the likeness of man to heal mankind, and was crucified, buried, and arose again on the third day. So just to clarify, not only is our Roman soldier hunting in a dark wood, chasing a stag, and then seeing this divine vision, the dead Christ figure also talks to him, which I think is just really extraordinary. So when he hears this, what does he do? He falls to the ground and says, I believe that you are he who created everything out of nothing, Lord. Okay, so he's immediately convinced and converted to the Christian faith upon encountering this divine vision. And I do think it's important for us to, again, think about the context and the significance of beginning the narrative story as we see it in the North Aisle of Canterbury Cathedral, with conversion, with kind of intimate, heartfelt acceptance that this faith is real. And I'm just drawing your attention to the relative iconographic similarity of the Pisanello Italian painting to the right from the 1440s, and our painting, which I'll start to talk about very soon, from the 1480s in southeastern England. So the other thing I want to sort of think about is, how did our painters in Canterbury Cathedral design this mural? And I've got a few ideas for that via recent scholarship, but for those of you who don't know a lot about the transmission of iconography in the medieval world, wall paintings are very, very big things that require a lot of technical attention, and you can't really make mistakes with them. So there's a lot of stages of planning that are necessary before executing a devotional painting. So we think, as historians of Gothic wall paintings in the Middle Ages, that these painters are looking at smaller scale images to sort of devise their cartoons on the wall surface. So I'm showing you here on the screen two examples of the vision of Saint Eustache from French manuscripts. One on the left is from the 13th century, and then one on the right is from the 14th century. And this is not to say that the painters in Canterbury Cathedral are bringing these expensive devotional books with them inside to kind of do their gigantic 19-foot mural. But I just want to say that these iconographic compositions are in wide circulation, and again, they seem to obey a strict set of rules about what the vision should look like. So Now I'm going to tell you the full, weird, wonderful story according to the golden legend of Saint Eustache. But I'm going to do so not with our mural, because I want to focus on the little idiosyncratic fun stuff. I'm going to do so by illustrating the narrative using this stained glass window from Chartres. Now, what you'll see in a moment is something a little different with the iconography, and I'll explain that. But again, this dates to the 1210s. It's designed by Gothic glazers. And just as an FYI, some of these stained glass craftsmen might have been aware of the stained glass windows in Canterbury. There's a lot of artistic exchange between Chartres, Saint-Denis, which I mentioned earlier, Sens, and Canterbury. A lot of these hands and ateliers and workshops are going to where the jobs are. So there's a tiny chance that there's a bit of symbiosis here. And it is possible that we have a lost stained glass window of Eustache in Canterbury from around the year 1200. Here on the screen, you're seeing the lowest image in the legend of Saint Eustache as it appears in Chartres Cathedral. He's the man hunting. So I'm going to tell you the story via the golden legend while pointing to these windows. He is a general in the Roman army, much loved by Emperor Trajan, who is presented in the text as a good emperor, unlike the man who follows him, Emperor Hadrian, who's the bad guy. And they're chasing this pack of beautiful deer in a very dark wood. And Eustache, as the leader of the group, separates from them when he spots the most gorgeous white hart. And he keeps chasing it into the depths of the forest. And then that's where he encounters the divine vision. I hope you can see from this wonderful rondel here, which appears at this point in the decorative program, the left rondel on the lower part of the register. We see an inscription identifying him as Placidas, his original name before conversion. There's his lovely horse behind him, and he is kneeling before the miraculous image of Christ crucified between the antlers of a deer. And he is immediately converted. So what does he do next? He takes the sacraments, and the other part of that vision tells him, go get baptized with your family. And that's what he does. He then, because he's meant to be in Rome, he therefore goes to the Pope to receive baptism. And what happens next? Well, he tells his family, we need to go do other things with our life. I am leaving the army. So he and his lovely wife, Theotisa, meet with other Christians to kind of go on a mission. And you can see Theotisa's two lovely sons here, one of which is called Agapetus, and the other is Theotis. And they follow their dad on his new life. And what they end up doing is they commission a boat to go to Egypt. So they go to Egypt, and it's a very long journey, and it's also expensive. And because now Eustache, he's left the name Placidus behind, he's also left his identity behind, he is no longer earning money. So he's actually broke when he boards the ship, which means, and this is a bit hard for me as a kind of 21st century feminist, but when they get to Egypt, Eustache agrees to give his wife to the captain as payment. So just to clarify, I know in the novel it's suggested that she is sort of kidnapped by pirates. Really, it's the saint himself being like, bye, Theophisa, we're broke. Thanks for doing this for us. Ooh, and that's what it says in the holy text. So he's in Egypt with his two boys. He's just basically sold his wife so he can get transit paid for. He's very sad about it, though. We're made aware that he's distraught. He wanders through the woods with his boys, but then disaster strikes. He gets to a river, and as he starts to cross this river, a lion grabs one of his sons and tears his body across to the other side, which is awful. And just as Eustache is looking to his son to say, oh my gosh, he's just being grabbed by a lion, that's what happens. His other son gets bitten by a wolf and chased across the other river. It's Sophie's choice, but in the Middle Ages. And he's therefore stuck in the river. He can't decide who to save. So poor Eustache then is sort of left on his own with no wife, and he's lost his sons to two beasts. We're told in the Golden Legend that, don't worry, both of the boys are then raised by nice peasants. But Eustache then sort of walks around looking for them, and he's very, very sad. Luckily, because of divine will, his wife returns to him. You can see that illustrated in the lower left rondel here, and he finds his sons. And then they all dine happily together. But guys, it's going to get bad. This isn't really a happy moment, because word gets around to the new emperor that Eustache is still in town, i.e. in Egypt. So they go get him and bring his family back to Rome. You meet with the emperor, and the emperor says, join us again and we'll pay you well. And they say, okay, fine, I will join you again as your general. But the new emperor, Hadrian, then requires Eustache and his family to worship false idols. Uh-oh. So, of course, Eustache is a Christian, denies, he says, I cannot do this, absolutely not. I will not bow down to false idols. And what happens next, I'm sorry my image is not very clear, but at the very top of the window we see the martyrdom of Saint Eustache and his wife and his 2 sons, compelled by the Emperor Hadrian for not sacrificing to idols. They are boiled alive in a bronze bull-shaped cauldron. However, we learn from the Golden Legend that their bodies remain intact for 3 days after they are boiled, and then the Christian community in 2nd century Rome takes their bodies and buries them. A cult then grows up around those bodies, which is the putative site of the Church of San Eustachio in Rome. So what a story, eh? It's really quite fun. And again, in the case of this window, as it is in the case of the wall painting, we read the story from the bottom up, lifting our eyes to heaven, picturing his soul and the souls of his family in a better place by the end of it. And just for fun, if you don't know about the windows of Chartres Cathedral, they are delightful. Again, they're very similar to our wonderful windows in Canterbury. But here's a sense of the program. The other thing I love about the windows in Chartres is if you look closely at the base of the images, you will see the local community that paid for their design. So you've got leather tanners there, you've got brewers that pay for certain windows. There's even the Guild of Prostitutes that pay for some windows there. The windows of St. Eustache are paid for by furriers and kind of leather makers. And it makes sense, I think, given the connection perhaps with the bull at the very end. So if you look carefully at the window, you'll see them speckled throughout the story, kind of selling their wares, which I like very much. So where does this leave us with our understanding of what would have been seen by our author back in 1974 and 1979? And how does this impact our understanding, our interpretation of the wonderful wall painting of St. Eustache and his legend in Canterbury Cathedral? Well, for those of you who haven't been inside, when you enter Canterbury Cathedral, please proceed up past the massive screen beyond the tower on the north side or left side of the nave. Keep on going upstairs, and then if you look to your left before the transept crossing, you'll see this huge painting, 19 feet in height. So it's on the north wall of the north ambulatory opposite the choir. Now, the wall painting is placed into what we call a blind arch. Originally, there would have been a stained glass window there that probably dated to around the year 1130, because this part of the wall was constructed in the 1130s under Prior Ernulf, or rather his legacy paid for it. Now, for those of you who don't know about the history of building at Canterbury Cathedral, the East End caught fire in 1174, just 4 years after Becket's blood and brains were spread across the pavement in his violent martyrdom in 1170. So the building is then reconstructed from 1174 in the new Gothic style, and it also facilitates devotion to the cult of St. Thomas Becket. And we have a wonderful primary source record which tells us all about the building of the church at this time, and we learn the name of the architect. His name was William of Sens, and by 1177 he'd raised the tower that is just on the other side of this mural. And so art historians assume then that the glass was knocked out and they blocked it up with strong stone around the 1170s. Okay, so this was a kind of empty space that's thrusting up the huge new Gothic tower. And that's so interesting to me because it seems as if there wasn't a painting here then for another few centuries. I'll get into that in a moment. So again, if you're looking down the east end of Canterbury Cathedral, our wall painting is on the left. So when was this discovered? It was found in 1830 under whitewash, and it is assumed that this painting, along with most other paintings of saints and other problematic images, were covered up in the wake of the Reformation from about 1538 onwards. And then in the 1930s, after copious studies conducted in the 1920s, E.W. Tristram exposed, totally exposed, and then restored the painting with two women. We don't have their first names, but they're Miss E and Miss M Bridges. And it would have been a meticulous process. And he was really fond of using wax to press in and lift out problems. But oh dear, that was really damaging. And the kind of greenish, brownish tint Hoban even comments on in the painting is probably the result of what Tristram did to intervene in the story of its restoration. And then in the 80s, there was a new restoration program which filled in some gaps using sort of dichloromethane and everything. So what we see today is the product of that cleaning off of what Tristram did. And I'm just showing you too, so the image that's reproduced in some editions of Ridley Walker shows Tristram's watercolor. And his watercolors are on display today in front of the mural too. So, and this is also a detail from Tristram's watercolor, which makes the image more clear to see. And here's the very famous representation of the martyrdom. I hope it's now clear, the boiling bull and the four bodies. So that's at the very apex of the image. So in the remaining sort of 5 minutes, I'm just going to tell you about the technique and the design, and I want to leave you with some weird hypotheses here. Art historians are convinced, or at least have been since Tristram's work, that the painting dates to the year about 1480. Now, this is through kind of stylistic comparisons with other paintings that have survived from England around this time. A close inspection of the mural implies that the painters did a sort of plan in advance using a sort of red undercoloring. And they did actually adjust then their final vision as they went. It makes sense for us to realize that they would have painted from top to bottom. And this means that kind of later layers wouldn't have dripped on earlier ones. So again, with wall painting, it's all very logical and practical, which is one reason I like to study it. It looks like the wonderful verdant landscape came into form first, and the figures were added afterwards as they moved top down. So the story, to be clear, proceeds from the bottom up, but the execution of the painting would have been technically moving from the top down. A lot of green is used here. It's important to me that there's no blue. Blue would have been one of the most expensive pigments in the 15th century, and it's notable that it's not here. With that said, there is some gold. There's gilding on the halos, etc., which is very nice. And here's another nice detail of all of that wonderful green. The design, well, it's a kind of complicated, chaotic image, isn't it? There's roughly about 5 scenes from the legend I've just described depicted here. We've got 2 thick bands at the top and bottom. The conversion is about 6 feet in height, and the martyrdom is about 6 feet in height. And then we have 3 very sad scenes in the middle. And again, we proceed upwards, and we've got this fantastic semi-aerial perspective as we go. Now, what is scene number 1? It's his conversion. It's the vision. I want to just quickly draw your attention to the beautiful contemporary hunting dress worn by Eustache, or at this time, I guess, Placidus, and his gorgeous gray dappled horse. And I'm just also, please, can you help me see? There's this wonderful little cluster of buildings, these lovely little houses with sloping roofs and arcades with red kind of tiles at the top behind the gray horse. And just if you haven't seen this yet, my colleagues at the University of York have just created a new visualization of medieval Canterbury as it appeared in the 15th century. This is now digitized and freely accessible online at story.org, and you can sort of look at what medieval Canterbury would have resembled in that time. And I think it's important that we have this mise en scène of the images, the buildings from Canterbury as they would have appeared at the time in the wall painting, which is quite nice. And here again is their wonderful visualization. So what happens next? Well, after the conversion through the amazing vision is the baptism. And what's so interesting too is there are fragments of the lost figure of the Pope in the interstices of the arcade, which is so exciting, and a mini micro-architectural image of the Basilica of St. Peter's. So just again, this is the baptism scene on your left. Can you see this arm with a bowl reaching out to the side, dipping the, well, kind of wetting the holy water on Eustache and his family. And I'm comparing it on the right with a 15th century image from a book of hours in France to make it more clear to you how we see the baptism. What happens next? Well, I've used the word kidnapping here because I think it's more effective with what the novel references with the pirates and everything. But this is when the wife of Eustache is remains on the boat as payment, as it were. And the men sort of we're told in the Golden Legend, when he leaves his wife behind, he and his boys are destitute and naked. But I guess painters deem that to be inappropriate. Here you can see father and two sons sort of sadly gesturing towards their wife mother, who's this very large figure in a very tiny boat, right at the center of the wall painting. Scene 4, When Animals Attack. I'm sorry about my cheesy title, but this is the moment when both of his boys get ripped across the river. And I'm just going to quickly show you that image here. So here, that the most monumental depiction, standing at the center of the mural, is that sort of frozen figure of Eustache. And in the Golden Legend, we're told that a divine voice tells him, Eustache, have faith, for in a short while your honor and dignity shall be restored to you, along with your wife and your children. So even though he's stuck and sad and devastated that he thinks his two sons have been ripped to death by wild beasts, he is steadfast in his faith. Now, you might think that this figure at the center with his frontal-facing gaze at us as viewers is unique, but I think it's interesting to note that this is quite typical in representations of this scene in the Legend of Saint Eustache if we look at French illuminations. So here I'm showing you two other examples from contemporary, or actually earlier books. You can see the wolf and the lion ripping the boys away. Moving to the very end, the martyrdom and the brazen bull. Our painters have sort of skipped a number of scenes in the story, and they get to the climax, which is the holy death of the man and his family. We're told that Hadrian commands this event to happen, and in the painting, Hadrian looks amazing. He is bedazzled. He's got red pantyhose and vermilion. He's got sort of a trimmed ermine mantle, and all of his courtiers, who are equally fabulously dressed, are sort of stoking the flames and putting the family down with pitchforks. And Hadrian also has a kind of court jester at his feet. So I'm sorry this image isn't very clear. His dying words, by the way, Eustache, are, I worship our Lord Jesus Christ and serve only him. Here's Tristram's watercolor, which I hope makes more sense of the iconography. So note that Eustache, Theophisa, and their two children are quite stoic and fine despite this horrible scene, and above them, their lovely little naked souls are ferried up to heaven. So that's the kind of end of the narrative. So I just want to conclude with a few fun points now that we've walked through the legend of St. Eustache. What is Eustache doing in Canterbury Cathedral in the 1480s? We don't know is the short answer. And it's weird to realize that we only have evidence for 3 other churches, all of medieval England, dedicated to this soldier, mystic, Roman saint. The Canterbury painting is also the only known example of its kind in all of England. We don't even have a trace of a wall painting of St. Eustache in another English medieval church. So we assume then that his cult has come to Canterbury via French networks. We assume, too, that there might have been a body part of Eustache somewhere in the confines of the cathedral. But one of the biggest things to sort of leave you with is, I hope it's important, it's really important to reflect now more than ever, perhaps, on this, but Canterbury Cathedral has long been a site of healing, with the cult of Becket being sort of attracting hundreds of thousands of pilgrims in the Middle Ages who journeyed to touch the saint and improve their condition and to help others who were sick. There are a number of other cults in Canterbury Cathedral associated with health and healing. St. Eustache was one of the 14 holy helpers, and it may come as no surprise, given his boiling to death in a bowl-shaped cauldron, that he can help you with fever. So I think at the moment we assume that his presence in the cathedral is one of a kind of entertaining, calming, and wonderful and delightful way of confirming to Canterbury pilgrims that it's all going to be okay. So I think I want to leave you with that sort of nice sense of what is he doing here, and how is he still sort of inspiring us, this figure, as it were. And I just want to borrow some of the terms used by our author. And he talks about how the image made him, he felt like he was being friends with his own head. And I think the mural of St. Eustache makes any visitor kind of walk into this extraordinary mystic imagination where you have wild animals and Roman soldiers, fancy dress and boiling bowls, and it's transporting. And even if Eustache isn't actually kind of actively healing people today, there's something quite healing just in looking at the mural. And I think we can see this in this wonderful book too. So thanks so much for listening. I'd be very happy to take questions in the chat.
Um, Thank you so much, Emily. It was absolutely fantastic talk. So interesting and so insightful. Um, do we have questions coming through on the chat? I'm just gonna come out of that. I've got a question here from Amy Cup. Oh, too much video there. We had a question from are the dogs of any significance in the legend? I think was the question.
Yeah, that's a nice question, Colin. So I think it's important to note that the dogs are never mentioned in any of these holy texts, but they become a way of edifying Placidus, or rather Eustachius' sort of high status role in later medieval depictions. And it's important for us to note that here in Canterbury, he has 3 gorgeous hounds, which just again goes to show that he had everything of material power and wealth and riches of this world, but he gave it all up for his faith in Christ. So I think one thing that might be simple to assume is the dogs are significant because it helps us to understand all the things he surrendered for his faith, including his 3 lovely dogs. And just to sort of draw your attention that in the lower left corner on the screen, you'll see what looks like a dog. That's actually meant to be a short-haired boar. And there's no other representation of a little kind of mopey looking figure in the lower left corner of the vision scene in any other painting in the history of art. And so we assume that our painters here in Canterbury just wanted to fill the void with another nice animal. So there's lots of fun animals here.
Fantastic. Quick question from Claire. Do you know what river he is standing in? What the name of the river is?
Yeah, I wish we did. I mean, I think he's meant to be standing in the River Nile, but I mean, it doesn't really look like the Nile to me. And I think our 15th century wall painters, yes, they would have been evoking this sort of ancient river. To me, it doesn't look too much like the Stour, but I think there is something. The thing I find so extraordinary about it is our vista over the river and how it peels into those wonderful little sort of curves and everything. But no, I think it's what we would call sort of a stylized representation. Yeah, I'd like to think it looks just like the Stour, but it doesn't.
Okay, we've got a question from Amy Cutler, and Amy asks, she was wondering about the link between hunting and reading. I remember reading a book by William Perry Marvin, I think, which linked the arts of hunting and the arts of literacy, or the veneer of book literacy, which to me connects with some Ridley Walker stuff about of reading, walking, and the pursuing of signs. So is there a link between hunting and reading?
Yeah, that's a lovely question. I mean, I think I'm no expert in the iconography of hunting, but I do think that the kind of mental exercise of kind of being a good scholastic reader in the high medieval period is often sort of compared and contrasted in these books with hunting pursuits. So picture, for example, a 12th or 13th century illuminated manuscript where you might have, you know, comments and glosses on canon law, and then in the margins with all of these sort of erudite text in the middle, in the margins you'll see thousands of hunting scenes, and sometimes they get absurd. So sometimes bunnies are chasing wolves, and sometimes, you know, you get silly beasts poking each other in the butt. But hunting metaphors are ubiquitous in medieval manuscripts about learning, thinking, reflecting, and reading. And the best scholar I would recommend anyone to read on this is Michael Camille, who talks about how the mise en scène of the page has that kind of dual relationship between center and margin, where you can have that kind of really intense scholarly text in the middle, but the delight in the margins actually helps you to reflect more and enjoy the process of learning and thinking and reading. So yeah, it's really fun stuff.
That's grand. We've got loads of questions coming in, so we'll try and get through as many as we can before we take a break. But Graham Head asks that he read that at the height of the Becket cult, there was an organised, structured path to the east end of the cathedral. Where do we think the mural was in the Becket possession or procession? I suppose the word there.
Yeah, that's a great question from Graham, and that's actually something I'm very interested in. So for those of you who have visited Canterbury Cathedral, I want you to picture the site of Becket's martyrdom. So that's in the north transept, further west from the location of this mural. And the entrance just behind it, the door will take you directly to the cloister. So if you're a pilgrim in the Middle Ages and you have come to Canterbury from, say, northern Italy or, you know, from Austria, you are going to walk in the footsteps of Becket's final footsteps. So you'll enter through the cathedral gate, you'll go across to the cloister, and then you'll walk up that sort of north wall of the cloister where Becket was putatively dragged in for sanctuary, but of course it didn't go that well. So you would encounter the site of Becket's martyrdom first. Now there's a lot of disagreement in the scholarship of what was the essential pilgrim's path thereafter. Some say you would go down into the crypt where his body was laid to rest until its translation in 1220 into the Trinity Chapel. Others say you then go immediately up. I do think it's interesting and meaningful that once you go up the stairs past the location of Becket's martyrdom, you have these wonderful arcades, these arches on your left. You have another scene of martyrdom right here. And you would encounter Eustache then before you go up again on the next level of stairs to see the body of Becket and the broken skull and brains of Becket. So I think Eustache is part of the staccato rhythm of devotion to martyrs as you go through the kind of fabric of the cathedral, but and it makes sense as part of Becket's story, and I'm interested in that, and I want to know more about it too.
Fantastic. We've got a few more questions, but we'll try and squeeze a few in before we take a break. Are the wolf and the lion symbolic in specific ways? Asks Fiona, fellow practice.
Yeah, I think for the hagiographers, they would have been the scariest beasts possible, and I think we have a lot of saints' lives which involve wolves and lions. And I should add that one thing our painter chose not to paint here is what Emperor Hadrian first said he would do to poor Eustache and his family. He said, I'm going to throw you to the lions. And then Eustache approaches the lions, and the lions then whimper and bow to him. And that's why they end up being boiled in the bull. So there's something to do with lions actually respecting Eustache, which I find very interesting. In terms of wolves, another very famous, there are two very famous saints' lives. I don't know, if you love wolves, I love wolves, but if you love medieval animals and wolves, look at the life of Saint Vincent and look at the life of Saint Edmund of, you know, Bury Saint Edmunds. In the life of Saint Vincent, there's this sort of his body, his dead body, which is dragged by a millstone and fantastically doesn't decay, is watched over by a raven who protects it from a wolf from eating it, because these saintly bodies need to stay together because that's how the relic cults start. So wolves are often used as a threat to the cult because they can eat the body. In the story of Saint Edmund, it's a lovely story where after he's assassinated by the Danes and his body is in the sort of in the forest, another forest saint too, a lovely wolf kind of guards it and protects him. And in the Middle Ages, a medieval skull of a wolf was on display in Bury St. Edmunds and worshipped as a contact relic. And you can see that skull today in the local museum, which is quite cool. So wolves and lions, they're everywhere, they're great.
That's a great answer. That I think also has to address another question for Holly Slingsby, who's asking were there any links to other animal-related saints. Probably got time for one question. Ian Nesbitt asks, can you say anything more about the solace for pilgrims?
Yeah, I think so. So I think Eustache is a kind of post-incarnation Job. I mean, I see his trials and tribulations. You know, he's not at the end of it on a dung heap, naked, but and mocked by his wife. But he's given everything up, and he has remained steadfast in his faith. And I think if we remember and reflect on Canterbury Cathedral as a space for healing, as a space for bringing hope to those who have come very far with great need, physical need and spiritual need, I would imagine that this delightful mural it's fun to look at. If you're a pilgrim in the queue, it's like Disneyland. You're stuck in the queue for a long time to venerate Becket, and I would love to be stuck next to this mural, being like, "Is that a lion?" You know, that seems to be what happens here. It does bring solace to a visitor, because if you work your way through the image, as Hoban did, you are rewarded at the end by the sacrifice of his flesh for his spirit. And I think for those pilgrims in pain, or for anyone just coming to terms with the mortality of their existence and the kind of the sort of the stress of lack of worry about wider humane issues, it brings great solace. And to this day, I do see people staring at it. I think because they find it hard to read, but hopefully they can ask each other, is that naked family being boiled to death in a bowl? And whenever I can, I'll be like, yes, it is. So I think to this day it brings solace as well because it's so delightful.